Before he was just the dad from the famous family, Jim Bob Duggar was an actual politician with real ambitions. And his final campaign collided with his son's conviction in the most brutal way you can imagine. We're talking about a man who once sat in a state capitol, who once put his name on a U.S. Senate ballot, who spent decades building a platform on faith and family and moral authority. And then, in the space of a few weeks at the end of 2021, all of it cracked open in public. This is the story you don't hear on the reunion specials. This is the part of the Duggar story that ties everything together. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's talk about Jim Bob Duggar, the politician. Because the man behind the smile in those family photos was chasing a very different kind of life before the cameras ever showed up. Now here's the thing most people get wrong about Jim Bob. When you turn on the reruns, when you scroll through the clips, when you read the tabloid headlines, he comes across as a TV dad, a guy in a sweater vest, a family patriarch with a soft voice and a big calculator who could tell you the exact birth weight of every one of his children. 19 kids, a wife who shared every camera frame, a Christmas card list that took up an entire page. That's the version most viewers know, and that's the version the show was built to sell. But that version is incomplete. And honestly, it's a little bit of a costume. Because before there was a show, before there was a brand, before there was a family compound being filmed for cable television, Jim Bob Duggar was a working politician with real ambitions and real votes attached to his name. And if you want to understand how this family got so powerful in their corner of the culture, you have to trace that political career. Because the show didn't make him a moral authority. The politics did. The show just put a camera on it. Let's start at the beginning, because this part surprises people every single time. Jim Bob Duggar won his first election in 1998. He didn't just talk about running. He didn't just put a sign in his yard. He actually ran. He actually campaigned. And he actually won. He served in the Arkansas House of Representatives for District 6, and he held that seat from 1999 to 2003. That is 2 full terms in a state legislature, sitting in a real chamber, voting on real bills, with his name on real ballots. He was a genuine elected official, not just a personality wearing a politician costume for the cameras. And that detail matters, because it changes how you read everything that came after. When the show eventually launched, and he started talking about values and government and faith in the public square, he wasn't speaking as some random reality dad with opinions. He was speaking as a former state representative. That gave him weight. That gave him credibility with a certain audience. And for years, the show quietly leaned on that credibility without ever fully explaining it to the casual viewer. The cameras showed you a man in a sweater. The resume behind him said something else entirely. And here's where the ambition gets even bigger. Because the Arkansas State House wasn't the ceiling for Jim Bob. It was the floor. In 2002, while he was still serving out his time in the state legislature, he took a much bigger swing. He entered the Republican primary for a seat in the United States Senate, running against the sitting Senator Tim Hutchinson. That's right, the Senate, capital S. The body that confirms Supreme Court justices, that ratifies treaties, that shapes federal law for 330 million people. Jim Bob Duggar wanted in. He lost that primary, and he lost it pretty decisively. But the swing itself tells you everything you need to know about the man's ambitions in those years. He wasn't satisfied with a quiet seat in Little Rock. He wanted Washington. He wanted the big stage. The ambition was always there, sitting right under the surface, even when the winds didn't follow. And once that Senate run was over, and the dust settled, and his term in the State House ended in 2003, Jim Bob found himself at a crossroads. The political door had narrowed, but another door was about to swing wide open. And that door had a camera behind it. Here's the piece that ties everything together, and I want you to really sit with this, because once you see how the two halves of his life fed each other, the whole Duggar phenomenon starts to make a different kind of sense. Politics and the TV image weren't two separate things running on parallel tracks. They were braided together from the very beginning, and they reinforced each other into a single platform of moral authority. Think about the message he ran on in his campaigns. Pro-family, pro-life, faith at the center of everything. Big household, traditional values, conservative through and through. Now think about the message the show sold to viewers week after week. Pro-family, pro-life, faith at the center of everything. Big household, traditional values, conservative through and through. It was the same pitch. The campaign trail and the camera crew were saying the exact same things in different rooms. And that's not an accident. The family brand absorbed his political identity and amplified it to a national audience that was many, many times larger than any voter base in Arkansas. By the time the show was in its prime, the Duggars weren't just a family on television. They were a kind of cultural argument, a living example held up by their fans as proof that a certain way of life was working. And the man at the head of the household wasn't just a dad. He was the closest thing reality television had to a movement spokesperson. Pull the politics out, and the brand loses its backbone. Pull the brand out, and politics has no megaphone. The two were inseparable, and that's exactly why what happened next hit so hard. Then came 2021, and you have to understand the timing here, because the timing is everything. The original show had been canceled for years by this point. The spin-offs were running, but the family's grip on the cultural conversation had loosened. And Jim Bob, the politician who never quite let go of ambition, decided it was time to make a comeback. He announced that he was running for Arkansas State Senate, District 7, in the fall of 2021, October to be specific. He stood up in front of supporters, made the announcement, and started the machinery moving. Yard signs, donors, press releases, endorsements, the whole apparatus of a real campaign. And on paper, you could see the logic. He had the name recognition, he had the network, he had the conservative platform he'd been refining for 2 decades on national television. He had a base of fans who, in his mind, would translate into a base of voters. Now, here's the part where you have to remember what else was happening that fall. Because while Jim Bob was filing his paperwork and shaking hands at events, his oldest son, Josh, was sitting in a federal courtroom in Fayetteville, facing charges that, if proven, would end any hope of the family's moral authority brand surviving. The campaign timeline and the trial timeline were running side by side, on the same calendar, in the same news cycle. And anyone watching from the outside could see the collision coming before it happened. Jim Bob, apparently, could not. Or maybe he could, and he ran anyway. Either way, the math was about to catch up with him in a way no campaign strategist could spin. December 9th, 2021. That's the date everything broke. On that day, the jury in Fayetteville returned a guilty verdict against Josh Duggar on the federal charges he'd been facing. Convicted. Not alleged, not accused. Convicted by a jury of his peers in a federal courtroom with the full weight of the Department of Justice behind the case. And just like that, the conversation around the Duggar family changed forever. The headlines that had been simmering for months exploded into something that couldn't be managed or framed or spun. Every news outlet in the country was running the story. Every former fan was processing what it meant. Every critic of the family had their worst suspicions confirmed in the most public way possible. And Jim Bob, who had been on the campaign trail just days earlier talking about values and family and faith, suddenly found himself the father of a convicted man on the front page of every major paper in the state where he was running for office. The primary for that Arkansas State Senate seat came in the weeks that followed, and the result was about what you'd expect once the verdict was in. He lost. Badly. He didn't come close. The voters of District 7 had their say, and their say was a clear, decisive no. In the span of a single news cycle, the conviction landed, the campaign collapsed, and a political career that had started back in 1998 came to what looked very much like a final stop. 2.5 decades of work, 2 attempts at higher office, 1 ill-timed comeback, and at the end of it, nothing. The collision wasn't just bad timing. It was the entire structure of his public life coming down at once. Now let's talk about what that conviction actually did to the family's standing, because the political loss was only half the story. The other half was the brand. For nearly 2 decades, the Duggar name had been synonymous with a very specific kind of moral argument. They weren't just famous, they were held up, they were used by fans and by the family themselves, as evidence that a particular way of living produced a particular kind of result. Strong marriage, big family, devout faith, wholesome kids. That was the pitch. That was the product. And the conviction didn't just damage that product, it contradicted it at the most foundational level. Because the man at the center of the case wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a distant relative pulled in from off-screen. He was the oldest Duggar son, raised inside the household that the entire brand was built around, presented to the public for years as the proof of concept. And when a jury said what it said, the proof of concept collapsed. The political career and the brand had always been the same engine, the same machine, running on the same fuel. When the fuel was cut, both halves went dark at the same time. The state Senate seat was gone. The moral authority platform was gone. The family's place in the conservative cultural ecosystem, the one Jim Bob had spent his whole adult life building, was suddenly something nobody wanted to claim out loud. That is what one verdict can do, when the verdict lands on the wrong son at the wrong moment for the wrong family. And here's where I want to slow down for a second, because there's something in this story that goes beyond the politics and beyond the headlines. And I think it's worth naming carefully, without cruelty, because the people who are actually hurt in this story deserve more weight than a one-liner. Jim Bob Duggar built a public career on the idea of family values. He ran for office on it. He raised millions of viewers on it. He stood in front of cameras and crowds and ballot boxes and made the argument that his way of life was an example worth following. And then his own family, the very thing he held up as the proof, became the place where the cracks were the deepest. There is a hard kind of irony in that, and I don't say it to mock anybody. I say it because it's the thing that makes this story matter beyond the gossip. A man who told the country what families should look like watched his own family produce a federal conviction. A man who asked voters to trust his judgment on values had to sit in a courtroom hallway and reckon with what those values had failed to prevent. The platform he built didn't just lose its credibility in some abstract sense. It lost it on the most personal terms imaginable, in the most public way available. That's the part the political analysis can't quite touch. That's the part you can't put in a campaign post-mortem. It's the human shape of what happens when a public identity and a private reality stop matching up, and the gap between them gets put on the evening news. So here's where we are now. The man who started his political career in 1998 with a win in Arkansas District 6, who took a swing at the U.S. Senate in 2002, who became one of the most recognizable conservative family figures in the country through nearly a decade of television, who tried one more time in 2021 to climb back into the chair he'd left behind, is currently, as of this video, not holding any elected office. The Senate dream is long gone. The State House seat is long gone. The 2021 comeback is gone. And the brand that used to make those things possible is in pieces. Whether he ever tries again is genuinely an open question. He's still got the name, he's still got some of the network, but the moral authority platform that made him viable in the first place isn't there to stand on anymore. And rebuilding it after what happened would take a kind of public reinvention that no Duggar has shown any sign of attempting. Maybe he stays quiet. Maybe he comes back as something different. Maybe one of his other kids picks up the baton and tries the political route themselves down the line. Stranger things have happened in Arkansas politics, and stranger things have happened in this family. But the Jim Bob Duggar of the campaign signs and the Senate ambitions and the sweater vest TV dad rolled into one tidy package. That version of him, that political brand, is finished. The collision in December 2021 finished it. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Jim Bob will ever run for office again? Do you think there's a path back? Or do you think the door is closed for good? Drop your prediction in the comments below, because I read every single one and I want to know what you think. Was the timing of that 2021 campaign just a tragic accident of the calendar? Or do you think a man that politically experienced should have seen the collision coming and stepped back? Tell me. And while you're down there, do me a favor and hit that like button if this video taught you something you didn't know before, because the algorithm runs on those likes, and the more people who see this video, the more we can keep telling the stories the family specials won't tell you. And if you're new here, if you stumbled onto this channel because you used to watch the show and you've been looking for someone who'll talk about it honestly, you are in the right place. Subscribe and hit the bell because I've got the next one coming, and it's another piece of the Duggar story that the primetime hour never showed you. Until then, take care of yourself, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.